Today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of the Sodder children. This can be a difficult, dark topic, and if you're sensitive to discussion of missing children or fire, you may wish to stop listening now. For 37 years, the grim billboard haunted the roadside of WV-16 in West Virginia. A massive sign featuring the black and white photos of 5 children. Bold text above their pictures read, "What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive?" It offered a $5,000 reward and, later, after many years and many false leads, $10,000. Those 5 missing, or possibly dead, children were at the heart of one of West Virginia's and America's most enduring mysteries. A heartbreaking story that pulled on the heartstrings, and all too often the imagination, of everyone who heard it. The parents of the missing children, George and Jenny Sodder, promised that they would search for their lost loved ones until their final days. The billboard didn't come down until Jenny Sodder passed in 1989. This is the story of the Sodder family. Here's what happened. George and Jenny Sodder were both Italian immigrants to America, both of whom came through Ellis Island and Americanized their names when they did. They met young. George worked as a coal miner in West Virginia and then later in the hauling trade. Eventually he would open his own company, Dempsey Hauling, which was based out of their home just north of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The two married, and between 1923 and 1943, they had 10 children, a newborn every 2 years, for 20 years. A staggeringly large family by today's standard, but it wasn't unusual at the time. The coal industry was in full swing in West Virginia, and George was able to make a good living by hauling it. The Sodders had a 2-story home, plus basement, on their strip of property next to the highway. He ran the business with the help of his older sons, though the 2 oldest, John and Joe, had both been away to serve in the war. Locally, the Sodders were considered a respectable, well-thought-of middle-class family. George was an opinionated man, and it didn't take too much to get him to speak his mind on any manner of subject, but he particularly had a lot to say about the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini and how vile he was. In 1945, in a town with a booming population of Italian immigrants, these opinions sometimes got George in hot water, though that never seemed to stop him from voicing his mind. The story of the fire that would eventually come to be the defining moment in the lives of the Sodder family is not a straightforward one. Even now, so far in the future, many see the story as one of a simple and tragic accident. Others see conspiracy. Still others incompetence and corruption. There are many tangled threads in this story, and I would ask you to follow me as I do my best to unweave them. It was Christmas Eve, 1945. This would be the first Christmas in 6 years that had not been overshadowed by war. That brought a certain relief and joy, both to the Sodder family and to the world at large. It was an imperfect joy for the Sodders, though, since, while their oldest son, John, had returned from the army already, his sibling Joe had gotten delayed at a military base in his return home. He would not be home for Christmas. While that cast something of a pall over the celebration, it was still a happy time. Marion, the oldest daughter of the family, had brought the younger children toys from her job at the dime store. While normally it would be the work of Jenny Sodder to see her children to bed, that night they begged to stay up late, listening to the radio and playing with their new toys. Jenny agreed. George and the eldest boys in the family had worked that day, and so they were keen to get to bed at their regular time. Jenny took their youngest daughter, Sylvia, only 2 years old at the time, to bed with her and George. She was young enough that she slept in their bedroom. The other children all slept in the converted attic. girls in one room, boys in the other. At 12:30 a.m., Jenny Sodder was awoken from her sleep by the sound of a phone call. The phone was in the office in the downstairs of the house. Jenny crept from her room and answered the phone. She would hear what she described as a weird laugh and an unfamiliar drunken voice. This turned out to be a wrong number. On the way back to bed, however, Jenny noticed that the youngest children were nowhere to be seen. Marion, who should have been responsible for putting them to bed, had fallen asleep on the couch. The lights were still on, the curtains open, and the door unlocked. Jenny assumed the children had simply gone to bed on their own after Marion fell asleep. She took a moment to draw the curtains and lock the front door before she headed back to her own bed. Jenny dozed back off toward a peaceful slumber. She would later say it was around 1 a.m. when she was awoken again, though this timeline is somewhat contested by later evidence. She heard the sound of something hard hitting the roof and rolling off of it. To quote Jenny, "Something hit the roof like a rubber ball. It rolled and hit the ground with a thump." After listening for a few minutes, she went back to sleep. This too is not really unusual. If you've lived out in the country or in an old farmhouse, you know that these kinds of noises are not uncommon. She probably chalked it up to an animal and drifted back to sleep. Once again, she awoke a half hour later, this time to the smell of smoke. This would put the fire starting sometime between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, though later witnesses would say that when they saw the blaze, it was only 1 a.m. These accounts, too, would be contested. Regardless, Jenny Sodder threw herself from her bed and shouted to wake her husband. The fire had started in George's office, where the phone was, and was spreading quickly. Sylvia, the youngest girl, was sleeping in Jenny and George's room, and so she was taken outside first. Marion, who had been asleep on the couch, also quickly escaped the flames. Jenny would later recall that it was around this time that the lights in the house burned out. George and Jenny went to the bottom of the stairs that led to where the children were sleeping and yelled for them, over and over. John and George Jr. eventually came stumbling down, their hair singed by flames. In the initial aftermath of the fire and the original police report, John and Joe would claim that they had shaken their brothers awake upstairs and that they were supposed to be just behind them. Later, their story would change to say that they had shouted for their brothers to wake up, but did not stay and ensure that they did so, and did not see them. With fire already engulfing the staircase, George went around the outside of the house to a window that led to the stairway landing. He broke the window with his fist, cutting his hand badly, but could not climb inside. The only stairwell and the only practical way out of the blazing Sodder home was now inaccessible. George, Jenny, John, George Jr., Marion, and Sylvia had made it outside. That left Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty unaccounted for. Marion tried to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. In 1945, there was no such thing as a direct dial phone. You called an operator, and the operator would patch you through to whoever you were trying to speak to. But Marion couldn't get a hold of the operator. She would then run to the neighbor's house to try to phone from there, but again, the operator could not be reached. While she was doing this, George ran to the other side of the Sodder home. They kept a ladder propped up near the attic window. George knew he could use this to get up and into the attic and get the children to safety. But the ladder was nowhere to be found. Bizarrely, the ladder would later be located 75 feet away at the bottom of a ditch. It has, to this day, never been made clear who moved the ladder, when, or why. Frustrated, desperate, and terrified, George and John came up with the plan of driving one of their work trucks under the window and climbing up to it that way. But even though the trucks had been used for work earlier that day, neither of them would start now. It's unclear if this was due to a mechanical problem, user error, or something else. But with the staircase inaccessible, the ladder missing, the trucks inoperable, George did the only other thing he could think of. He went to his barrel of rainwater with the idea that at least throwing some buckets of water into the fire might buy his children a bit of time for the fire department to arrive. But it was Christmas Eve, in the middle of the night, in West Virginia. The rainwater barrel was frozen over. George was helpless. He could only wait, pinning his hopes on the local fire department. He had no idea yet that they were not coming. While Marion's attempts to contact the fire department had failed, that is not where the efforts ended. One of George's neighbors had seen the blaze while driving by, and he had turned around to head toward a local tavern and use their phone. But, like Marion, he got no response. This heroic soul then drove back into town to personally find the fire chief and rouse him from his Christmas Eve slumber. The fire chief was a man named Forrest J. Morris. And this is where things get complicated. There was no fire alarm in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The fire department instead used what was called a phone tree system to alert firefighters to an emergency. Morris would call several firefighters, and each of them would be responsible for calling several more, and so on. This, of course, takes a lot of time. And it seems that on Christmas Eve, many of these firefighters were uninclined to answer the call. Whether that's because they were sleeping, or they had been celebrating and imbibing the night before, or they simply didn't hear the phone ringing. I won't speculate. But it took an exceptionally long time to rouse any sort of help for the blaze at the Sodder family home. To make matters worse, Morris, despite being the fire chief, was not qualified and licensed to drive a fire truck. He had to wait until a qualified driver could be woken up and arrive at the firehouse before even setting out. To make matters worse, the fire department was low on qualified manpower. After years of war, and many soldiers not yet having returned home, there simply weren't many able, willing, and capable people in the fire department. When a truck finally did arrive at the Sodder home, it was 8 hours later. Reports say that the fire burned for about 45 minutes before the roof collapsed and the entire structure of the house was driven down into the basement. When Morris and his firefighters arrived, the Sodder home was a bed of smoldering embers. At the time, George and Jenny thought that their 5 children had passed that night, lost in the fire. Morris and his crew sprayed water over the still smoldering wreckage of the Sodder home before, around 10 a.m., they began an informal search for the remains of the children. They searched for 2 hours, and no skeletal remains were found. Morris suggested that perhaps the fire blazed so hot that the skeletons were completely destroyed, vaporized. Many would later argue that this simply isn't possible. Even in a professional cremation, there are pieces of bone remaining. Bones require a steady temperature of 1400 to 1800 degrees to cremate, and even that leaves fragments behind. House fires generally do not burn hotter than 1100 degrees. While this could, theoretically, eventually degrade a skeleton, it would take many, many hours at a consistent heat and moisture level to do so. Other professionals have pointed out in the years since then that a 2-hour search for human remains in a house fire is, frankly, a little ridiculous. Such a search, even in optimal conditions, could take days, or even weeks to produce results. Still, we're not talking about looking for the remains of one skeleton. There were 5. But I leave it to you whether this is evidence of absence or whether it's evidence of incompetence. After this cursory 2-hour search, Morris called it off. He advised George to leave the site alone, not to touch it, until the state fire marshal had done a more thorough search. 4 days later, before that could be done, George had Jenny's brother, Frank Cipriani, bulldoze 5 feet of soil into the basement to cover it up. He wanted to plant a memorial garden for his children. To an outsider with modern knowledge, this action looks horrifying, even suspicious perhaps, for the father of the children to be told not to touch the site of the fire only for him to bulldoze earth over it. But I would beg you to consider the matter from George's perspective. George Sodder loved his family and had just lost 5 children. He had done everything he could to save them. From his perspective, what F.J. Morris and his firefighters did was show up 8 hours late to the house. They took a very cursory glance at the ruined building and more or less said, "It's Christmas, and I don't want to spend it searching for bodies." They went home rather than look for the Sodder children and told George to just leave it, that someone else would be by to handle it at some point. The grief and outrage of the Sodders must have been incalculable. Though it ended up causing harm, I think we can forgive the things done under the veil of that tragedy. On December 30th, the coroner issued 5 death certificates, one for each of the Sodder children. The cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation, but in the days that followed, there were things that, at least to members of the Sodder family, did not line up. The state fire marshal said that the likely cause of the fire was faulty wiring, a short circuit in the rear of the house. But George had actually just had the wiring of the house inspected and approved by the power company a few months earlier. Further, if the rear of the house, near George's office where the fire had started and where there was indeed an electrical panel, had been the source of the fire, how was it that the lights had still been on in the house until partway through the blaze? If the back office fuse box had shorted and caused the fire, the lights should have been out. The Sodders would later recall that at no point during the fire, while they were desperately calling out to their children and trying to rescue them, did they ever hear a shout back. And Marion Sodder would later say of that Christmas Eve, "I never smelled burning flesh. They say that you can smell burning flesh miles away, but I never did." It was also revealed that the telephone line leading to the Sodders' home had been cut cleanly, not burned through. 14 feet above the ground, and 2 feet away from the nearest utility pole, someone had sliced neatly through the phone wire. A witness came forward claiming to have seen a man at the scene of the fire stealing a chain block pulley system, something that George used in repairing his trucks. If you're not familiar, this is a large, cumbersome system that can be used for lifting particularly heavy weights, like leveraging the engine out of a hauling truck. This eventually led police to a man named Lonnie Johnson. Johnson admitted to the theft, and admitted to cutting the phone line the night of the fire. Bizarrely, he would claim that he thought he was cutting the power line instead. He denied having anything to do with the blaze. He was merely an opportunistic, bottom-feeding thief with a complete lack of moral character of any kind. But even then, we must examine whether Lonnie's story makes any sense. How did he get up the utility pole to slice the line? Did he steal the ladder from the side of the Sodder house to do it, and then later ditch it? If so, he made no mention of it. Further, why would he cut the power line to steal from their barn? It makes no sense. How would that benefit his theft in any way? He did succeed in stealing from the Sodders, even if he was eventually caught. So how would severing the power line, which he didn't actually do, have helped him? At best, one can look at this story and make some uncharitable assumptions about the intelligence and moral character of Lonnie Johnson. At worst, many look at his story and see the seeds of something more sinister. Other oddities began to appear around the fire and would eventually form the basis for the mystery that has made this tragedy so enduring. In October, 2 months before the fire, George Sodder had been visited by a life insurance salesman named Russell Long. Long had been put up to this by George's former employer, a man named Fiorenzo Gianotello. It seems Long, the salesman, had gotten into an argument with George over his outspoken opinions about Mussolini. When George rejected the salesman's offer, the salesman was heard to leave the property while shouting, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke. Your children are going to be destroyed." Quite the insurance pitch. He was also heard to say as he retreated, "You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." On its own, a strange but not necessarily damning experience. However, Fiorenzo Gianotello, who had sent the insurance salesman to see George, also happened to be the co-signer of the Sodders' home insurance, since he had been George's friend and employer. He was also the director of the Fayetteville County National Bank. This home insurance had been quietly, without the consent or knowledge of the Sodder family, increased from $1,500 to $1,750 just before the fire. That's roughly $24,000 in today's money. And the coroner's jury that had declared the Sodder fire an accident due to faulty wiring? Russell Long, the life insurance salesman that had threatened George, was on that jury. Is it possible that this was just the odd twists and turns of living in a small town while many people were away at war? Perhaps, but it is certainly an awful lot of coincidences stacked one upon the next. Other stories emerged in the days and weeks following the tragedy. Some of the Sodders said that they had seen a strange car parked just down the road, watching the youngest Sodder children come home from school and play in the yard. George recalled that months previous, a man had come seeking work at the Sodder home. When he was refused, he pointed to George's electrical box and said, "That's going to cause a fire someday." A late-night bus driver would say that at around 1 a.m., the night of the fire, he had seen a car pulled off on the side of the road outside of the Sodder home, where a man was lobbing balls of fire onto the rooftop. Needless to say, the more time passed, the less convinced the Sodders were that their children had died in the flames. Rather, due to the lack of human remains and all of the bizarre stories coming forward, they increasingly believed that their children had been stolen from them, perhaps as a revenge plot for George's beliefs about Mussolini. The Sodders began to investigate matters on their own. Jenny did experiments with the bones of animals and housing materials, seeing if she could, in fact, get the bones to disintegrate completely by replicating the fire. She could not. They also hired private detectives. The most well-known of these was a man named Oscar Cole Tinsley, sometimes misattributed as C.C. Tinsley due to a typographical error. According to Tinsley, in the years following the fire, he heard rumors that Forrest J. Morris, the fire chief, had claimed to people that he did find a body part in the wreckage of the Sodder home, a human heart. This is a difficult and dubious claim. Morris is now simultaneously claiming that the fire burned so hot and so long that it completely vaporized 5 human skeletons, and also to have found a heart in recognizable condition. According to Morris, he took the heart, put it in a box, and buried it in what would become the memorial garden on the Sodder property. George and Tinsley took Morris out to the property and made him dig it up. They did in fact find a box, and they did in fact find something inside of it. For reasons that are unclear, rather than taking the heart to the police to be inspected, George took it to a man named Harold Gay, who worked at a nearby funeral home. Gay inspected the object inside the box and determined it to be beef liver, not a human heart. Tinsley wanted to have it more thoroughly inspected to be sure. He asked Gay to preserve the object with embalming fluid so that it wouldn't deteriorate further while he lined up someone to take another look. Gay agreed. After embalming, he placed the beef liver, still in the box, on his back porch because of the smell. 10 days later, when Tinsley finally showed up to collect it and bring it to an expert, the box and the contents inside had gone missing. Later, Tinsley would hear rumors in town that Morris had told other people he purposefully and knowingly buried a piece of beef liver on the Sodder property and then called it a heart in an attempt to placate the grief of the Sodder family, intentionally lying to them and obfuscating the truth in an already confusing debacle of a case. Was Morris corrupt? Merely well-intentioned but incompetent? Or was this an attempt to put things to rest and dissuade any further investigation? Did he know that there was something else afoot and was trying to quietly put things to bed? In 1947, 2 years after the fire, George and Jenny reached out directly to the FBI and asked for help investigating. J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, wrote them personally and responded by saying, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of the FBI." However, associates of Hoover's did volunteer to assist the Sodders with their investigation if they were given permission to do so by the authorities of Fayetteville. Their offer was declined. George was now spending his own money and time chasing down leads. He traveled all across the United States over the years, tracking down anyone who claimed to have seen the children. Anytime someone got a look at someone similar in appearance to his children, off he would go. He even saw a photograph in a magazine of school children in New York, and off he went. Of course, upon his arrival, they would not allow him to see the child in question. As time went on, so too did more and more stories spring from that tragic night. A witness, Ida Crutchfield, a motel manager, claimed to have seen the Sodder children at her motel a few days after the fire. The children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all Italian. She also said, "I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to speak to the children. One of them looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning." But Ida Crutchfield didn't come forward with this story until years later. How could anyone be sure, that far off, of the faces of 5 children who, at the time, would not have been particularly important to her? After all, motel managers see many people come and go. And if she did recognize them then, at the time she encountered them, why didn't she say or do anything until years had passed? Another witness claimed to have seen the Sodder children pass by them in a car while the fire was still blazing. Yet another said that she served the children breakfast at a diner hours after the fire. A letter from St. Louis said that Martha was alive and in a convent. Another lead came from a bar patron in Texas who claimed to overhear an incriminating conversation about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. Yet another from Florida said that Jenny's own brother, Frank Cipriani, had possession of Jenny's children in Florida. In 1953, the Sodders put up a billboard at the site of the fire by the highway. It had the faces of the 5 children and offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of one or all missing children. The reward would later be doubled to $10,000. Throughout all of this, the Sodders hired several private investigators. One of these was a pathologist from Washington, D.C. named Oscar Hunter. Hunter finally did the first thorough examination of the fire site ever. He found several pieces of bone, human vertebrae. These were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for proper identification. The report back from the Smithsonian said the vertebrae belonged to one person between 16 and 22 years old. This is even more bizarre, since the eldest of the missing Sodder children was only 14. Interestingly, the bones showed absolutely no evidence of having been touched by fire at all. In short, they could not have belonged to any of the Sodder children, and no satisfying or complete explanation for where they came from was ever discovered. In 1967, the Sodders received what many believe to be the most complete and compelling piece of evidence for the survival of their missing children. A mailed envelope addressed to Jenny, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside the envelope was a picture of a man in his mid-20s who bore a strong resemblance to Louis Sodder. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys. A90132 or 35. The family hired a private investigator to look into this matter, of course. The investigator took the money George offered him and then was never heard from again. Many people have tried to decipher the message on the postcard. Louis did not have a brother named Frankie, but Jenny did, Frank Cipriani, who lived in Florida. And in among all of the rumors and stories, there was one that said the children had been spotted in a car driving away on the night of the fire, and that the car had Florida license plates. Eventually, they did succeed in hiring an investigator to look into Frank Cipriani. The investigator found him living with 2 children and found documents that positively stated and verified that they were his own family. Even without deciphering the message, the Sodder family firmly believed that the picture was indeed Louis Sodder. They added the photograph to their billboard. That same year, the Sodders received a letter from a woman in Texas who claimed to have met Louis and Maurice Sodder talking in a bar in a Mexican border town. George and his son-in-law, Sylvia's husband, drove down to the town and found the men, who now denied being the Sodder children. George and Jenny Sodder went to their graves, believing that their children were still out there. George died in 1969. A year prior, he had said to the Associated Press, "As long as we live, we will dig into it, to come out with an explanation of what really happened 23 years ago in that fire." In 1975, Jenny told the Beckley Post-Herald, "Somebody stole them, that's what. It's been a long time, but maybe I'll be lucky enough to see them someday. Maybe somebody will drive by and see the billboard. You never know." After George's death, Jenny wore only black for the rest of her days. In 1989, when Jenny Sodder passed, the billboard, now old, weather-beaten, and even riddled with bullet holes, finally came down. It had stood for 37 years. Sylvia, only 2 at the time of the fire, died in 2021 at the age of 79. She remained convinced throughout her life that her siblings had escaped the flames. Her daughter, Jenny Hinthorn, said, quote, "Do I believe that they perished that night? I do not. I don't think they're here. And if they're still here, I don't think they're in West Virginia." The story of the Sodders and the mystery of what happened to their children is, for better or worse, all but mythologized in American history at this point. Was the fire a tragic accident and nothing more? If so, are we to believe that the cut phone line, the theft, the missing ladder, the non-functioning trucks, and the eyewitness report of someone throwing fireballs at the house are all coincidence? Where are the remains of the Sodder children? Are we to believe Fire Chief Morris that the skeletons vaporized, but the heart remained? Or was that a lie? If it was a lie, was Morris's heart in the right place? Or was it a cover-up for something worse? There are a great many bizarre stories surrounding the Sodder family, and the fire, and what happened to them that night. So many, in fact, that it becomes difficult to conceive of the idea that it's all coincidental and nothing more. I don't believe that the mysteries around this tragedy will ever be fully explained now. Perhaps there is something that we can take from it, though. That is, of course, the importance of a speedy, thorough, competent, and professional response to both fires and to crimes. Had either of those been the case here, it's unlikely we would even be discussing this now. But sadly, stories of incompetence and corruption are far from uncommon. At the very least, the fire at the Sodder home was bungled in its professional response from start to finish. Thank you for listening. This has been A Troubled Past. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe and follow us on social media. What do you think of the story you heard today? Do you think the Sodder children survived the flames that night? What are your thoughts on Fire Chief Morris and his box of beef liver? Or the photograph that Jenny Sodder was convinced was a picture of her son as a grown man? Let me know in the comments. And please, let me know if there are any other stories you'd like to hear covered in this way.